Chapter 10, Part 3. I was having memory issues. I've cleaned it all up now. It should not cut off in the middle of a recording from here on, so sorry about that. I'm going to start at the beginning of this paragraph. The year 1883 was a bad year. True enough, Sardou approached her with another play, Theodora, but she had to put him off as she'd made a previous commitment to Jean Richepin. A man of his word, Richepin had waited until the banishment of Damala and had re-established himself as the current Bernhardt lover. He had also come forth with the promised play, and it was a pity that he had. The piece was Nana Sahib, and it was awful. Laid in India at the time of the Sepoy Mutiny, the plot involves a rebel potentate, Nana Sahib, Jama, his beautiful mistress, a large cast of improbable characters, and a mass of extras doubling as courtiers, sepoys, beggars, and British colonials. It had all the subtlety of a Barnum circus pageant, and the consensus of opinion was that it belonged not in the Ponte Saint Martin, but over at the Châtelet, where preposterous spectaculars still delight audiences of the bourgeoisie. But to make matters worse, the leading man after the first week fell ill, and Richepin, who fancied himself an actor, breezed confidently into the role, in which he was as awful as his play, and business plummeted to low depths. Meanwhile, Jacques Damala, temporarily cured, had been released from the sanatorium and, through some fluke, had been engaged by the Gymnase to star in the Georges Honnet's Maitre de Forges, in which it is a rich but boorish ironmaster with a heart of gold. Damala scored a personal hit. The Gymnase did not give midweek matinees. One Thursday afternoon, when the Porte Saint Martin box office had reached an all-time low, Damala showed up in the front row, made more conspicuous by the empty seats in either side of him. Whenever his former wife came down near the footlights, he'd turn around to look over the pitiful house, shaking his head and murmuring, "Poor Sarah." At the end of the performance, Richepin, without waiting to take a curtain call, rushed out to the main exit, and as Damala emerged with a sneering smile, the playwright grabbed him by the back of the coat, whirled him about, and gave him the mother and father of a beating up. This was not the only occasion when Jean Rapin defended his lady's honor with righteous force. In December, there appeared in the bookshops that vile little volume bearing the title The Memoirs of Sarah Burnham. It had a sententious, it said the Memoirs of Sarah Barnum, like Barnum and Bailey Circus. It had a sententious preface by Paul Bonnetain, who should have been ashamed of himself, for Bonnetain was a first-rate writer connected with the Figaro and the Revue Nouvelle. The author of Sarah Barnum, as has been mentioned, was Marie Colombier. For 3 years, Colombier had been plotting revenge on Bernhardt for the outrages she felt she had received during the American tour. As an actress, Colombier had made no name for herself, but she had achieved a certain reputation as a purchasable daughter of joy. I don't know what that means, but I don't think it sounds good. By then, she must have become a bargain item, for she was spoken of on the boulevards as le plate du jour. Doesn't sound good. And Goncart dismisses her as being little more than a prostitute. Oh, yeah. Clarification. The book purports to be an account of the notorious rise and degrading fall of an actress named Sarah Barnum. It parallels Bernhardt's beginnings and career closely enough to leave no doubt in any reader's mind as to the identity of the heroine, if such a monster could be called a heroine. Nor is the identity of the other characters left to the imagination. Julie Bernhardt is the elder Jewess. Aunt Rosine is Tante Rosette. Maurice is Loris, or Loris. His father, the Prince de Dygen, D-Y-G-N-E, Dyne, and so on. Even the heir apparent to the British throne is made yet more apparent than the title of the Prince of Ireland. The text is a clutter of revolting pornography, scatological vituperation, anti-Semitic venom, and scabrous lies. It attributes to Sarah Barnum the most atrocious behavior and sexual depravity that could have been invented by a filthy and malicious mind. The most atrocious behavior and sexual depravity that could have been invented by a filthy and malicious mind. Only a vulgar woman could have written it. As one reviewer pointed out, no man would have hurled such excrement at a rival. A side light on the nature of the work is that in order to read it in the Paris Bibliothèque Nationale, one must apply for the special permit to the Reserve, a department that contains works of a highly pornographic or blasphemous nature. An asterisk. NB. There is a volume available in the New York Public Library. Being in French, it may not have come under the scrutiny of the authorities. I should, however, advise against looking it up, as the book hasn't even the merit of being occasionally amusing. See if it's still there for historic purposes. I don't know. Who's out there in New York Public? Go look at the New York Public Library. See if it's still there after 70 years. It is quite possible that the memoirs of Sarah Barnum might have gone unnoticed by the public if some indignant but misguided friend hadn't brought Sarah a copy. Her reactions and those of her entourage are not hard to imagine. The first person to do anything about this salacious libel was Maurice. Accompanied by two young friends whom he appointed as seconds, he dashed to the Rue de Thon, where Marie Colombier lived, burst wild-eyed into her flat, shouting that he had come in behalf of his mother's honor, and demanded that she name some gentleman defendant whom he could immediately challenge to a duel. When she laughed and told him he was too young to be fighting any duels, he called her every name in his 19-year-old vocabulary, tore from the wall a framed sketch for the book's frontispiece, ground it to bits underfoot, and then, swearing vengeance, departed with his callow seconds. Mademoiselle Colombier's next intruders were Jean Rechapine and Sarah Bernhardt. The latter stormed in like vengeance personified. In one hand she flailed the air with a riding whip given her by Marshal Conrobert. In the other she brandished the dagger she used in Nana Sahib. At sight of them, Colombier fled through a door concealed behind a tapestry, while her caller, one Jean Soudan, stood guard against the assailants. The London Morning News of December 20th, 1883 reports, Madame Jean Soudan was attacked by, Monsieur Jean Soudan was attacked by Monsieur Rechapine, who wielded a large table knife and was very much excited. Madame Bernhardt lashed up sofa cushions and hangings and broke a considerable quantity of porcelain. Monsieur Rechapine offered the maid 1,000 francs to tell where her mistress was, but without success. The party then rushed out. The news item flashed across the Atlantic. The New York Herald gave it 6,000 words, and the Police Gazette bore on its pink cover a lurid drawing of the Bernhardt's attack. The foreign reportage was infinitesimal as compared to the coverage in the Paris dailies. To add to the limelight, Octave Mirbeau wrote a lacerating review of the book and a scathing denunciation of Paul Bonnetain for having lowered himself to write its preface. Octave Mirbeau, the novelist and playwright, his Les Affaires sont les affaires, ran for years in this country as Business is Business. Wrote countless articles for the papers, most of which were diatribes against some current social injustice. He was a vociferous espouser of all new trends in the arts and champion of causes to the point of frenzy. His friends, who called him Le Violent, said that Mirbeau woke up every morning in a rage, anticipating the 100 injustices he might encounter during the day. With it all, he was a popular man, a bon viveur, fond of good food and fine wines. He lived extravagantly, yet was continually starting crusades for the underdog. He took up the defense of the anarchist Ravachol, toyed with socialism, and during a noble savage phase, moved with his family to live in the country until he got fed up with the thick-headed stupidity of the average peasant. His unsolicited rushing to the defense of Bernhardt versus Colombier and Bonnetain was so execratory, the latter challenged him to a duel which took place a few days later. During its brief course, Bonnetain received a wound in the hand, not, unfortunately, his riding one, and Mirbeau was declared the victor. The result of all this farcical ruckus was an immediate soaring of sales for Sarah Barnum, which went into many printings. It did nothing, however, to boost the sales at the Port Saint Martin box office. In a very short time, Nana Sahib was obliged to fold. Sarah, in her fury, had the bad taste to write a rebuttal to Marie Colombier by way of a short book called The Life of Marie Pigeonnier. In it, she tried to smear her enemy with comparable venom, although she could never have brought herself to resort to Colombier's filthy vulgarisms. It was a childish and undignified gesture and served only to make Bernhardt look ridiculous. That beloved monster, the Paris public, were not amused, and the serradoteurs began to wonder if perhaps their idol might not have feet of clay. Judith Bernhardt died that year. Sarah described the event with characteristic romanticism. She was found stretched out on a yellow sofa, wearing an elegant negligee, her head against a lace pillow. Her lovely hands were holding the little table mat she'd been embroidering. She smiled coquettishly at death. The daughter was deeply grieved over the death of this mother who had shown her so little real motherhood. This was one of Sarah Bernhardt's many tunnel times, and she fell into one of her worst periods of depression. As always, money was short. She had lost a lot through Nana Sahib. Her household expenses continued at a ridiculously high level. Although her husband was no longer a liability, her son, the crown prince, was draining the family till with his fast horses, his clubs, his tailor's bills, and his gambling debts, for Maurice was an inveterate gambler. She turned to what was to be the sure expedient during financial straits from that time on, a revival of La Dame aux Camélias. Between 1884 and 1914, that frail lady and her unfading camellias were to be brought out of storage 22 times. For this revival, she had to find a new actress to fill the role of Nichette, which her sister had played hitherto. Jean Bernhardt, who had become a pitiful wreck from drug addiction, died during the run of La Dame, and that didn't lighten Sarah's depression. She had never outgrown her fierce family loyalty. Contemptuous as she may have been of Jean's weakness, she loved her in a protective fashion, and this death too opened up ancient wounds. In May, she and the Porte Saint Martin management put on Reshepin's adaptation of Macbeth. This proved to be as lamentable a flop as Nana Sahib. She blamed it on the hot weather and assured Reshepin that in cooler climes of London it would go like wildfire. It went with all the flair of a water-soaked log. It is not surprising that Macbeth failed in London, even if Reshepin's version may have been adequate. Every classical work suffers from translation, and perhaps the most acute sufferings are those undergone by the works of Shakespeare when transposed into French. Of all his plays, Macbeth would seem to be the least suitable for the Gallic tongue. One has only to read in the routine translation the scene with the Weird Sisters when the third witch, Troisième sorcière, utters the eerie cry, "All hail Macbeth and Banquo! Macbeth et Banquo, bonjour!" to realize the impossibility of transplanting Scotland's blasted heath onto the Paris boulevards. The Paris public, loyal as ever to the Bernhardt, was uncomfortably embarrassed by such distortion of their bard, and they breathed a sigh of relief when the theater bill changed and they could again flock to the gaiety to sob happily over the death of Marguerite Gauthier. There seemed to be a jinx attendant upon the Bernhardt Reshepin ventures, with La Glue, Nana Sahib, and Macbeth such dismal failures. 23 years later, in 1907, the two were finally to enjoy a joint success. This was The Sleeping Beauty, Reshepin's charming dramatization of Perrault's beloved fairy tale, an entertainment that was little more than a Christmas pantomime, but done with imaginative scenery and an exquisite musical score. Bernhardt, aged 63, played Prince Charming, and judging by all accounts, she was indeed completely charming. The piece had a gratifying run, and the Bernhardt Rishapine jinx was exorcised. In 1884, however, their relationships, both professional and personal, were not happy, and the partnership dissolved. That July, still in the slough of despond, Sarah returned to France. For solace, she went to the Normandy coast, where at Saint Adresse, near Havre, she owned a little villa overlooking the sea. Prior to World War II, it was still standing, and on the wall a commemorative plaque with the inscription, C'est ici de Sarah la joyeuse demeure. On y cante, on y rit, et parfois on y pleure. She returned to Paris still in her private tunnel. The pounds sterling she had accrued in London were slipping away like sands in an hourglass. There were no theatre prospects, and again she was met with a cold indifference from the Paris public. Then one bleak day, the clouds parted. The sun shone, and like a knight in glittering armor, that one bleak day, the clouds parted, the sun shone, and like a knight in glittering armor, Victorien Sardou came galloping to the rescue. His weapon for victory was the manuscript of Theodora. This is a shamelessly out-and-out melodrama dealing with the Empress Theodora, a former courtesan who, with her emperor husband Justinian, ruled 6th century Byzantium. The action takes place at the time of an attempted insurrection. In this first act, Theodora, listless and bored with court formality, slips off to the Constantinople slums to consult a gypsy friend of her low-life days, whose suggested remedy for the imperial ennui is a love potion. Yes, really. This Byzantine hormone concoction works beyond Theodora's most amorous dreams, and she falls madly in love with a young commoner named Andreas. Disguised and using a fictitious name, she visits him nightly and learns of a conspiracy to kill the emperor and empress, but has no idea that Andreas is in on it. She warns Justinian of the plot, and he takes measures to trap the would-be assassins, of which there are 2, as they enter the palace. There is a breathless pause when everyone waits. Then the sounds of a scuffle and the cry of "Help, Andreas!" as the first man is apprehended. Theodora, the only one to hear the words, is appropriately horrified. She rushes to an immense brass-studded door, barricading it with her arm and body in an attitude immortalized by the photographer Nadar, and Andreas has time for a getaway. The trapped conspirator is dragged before the emperor and questioned as the identity of his companion. The man refuses to talk, and Justinian, after launching into a minute description of the highly unappetizing tortures that await him if he keeps silent, goes out, leaving the terrified prisoner alone with the empress. Theodora, in despair, tells him that Andreas is her lover, and adds that under the unspeakable torture his friend won't be able to keep from naming him. The man begs her to kill him then and there. As they look about for a suitable lethal weapon, he suggests the long ornamental pin in her hair. She replies that being gold, it won't be strong enough. He bares his chest and orders her to run it through his heart. As she hesitates, he threatens to cry out her lover's name, at which she stifles his mouth with her left hand, drives home the pin with her right hand, and the man falls down dead. All of which, wrote Sarcey, is fantastically improbable, but the effect is nonetheless prodigious. The denouement of this cheerful evening in the theater is that after several scenes of elaborate pageantry involving a large cast, Andreas is caught and executed, though not before learning that his mistress is the empress. Justinian finds out about his consort's extramarital dalliances, and the curtain falls with Theodora being led away. About her neck, a rope with which she is to be garroted. This was one play in which the Bernhardt scene took place offstage. Preposterous as the story outline may be, Theodora gave Sarah a chance to let off all the fireworks, a few yet untried. Sardou had written every line with her in mind, and the role suited her like a tight-fitting garment. The piece was brilliant in construction and detail. Sardou was an avid student of history, and in the case of every period play he wrote, and he wrote a great many, he put in months of scholarly research beforehand. He had long specialized in the Byzantine area, and all his situations were founded on a fact, unless they impeded dramatic effect, in which case drama won out. Actually, the Empress Theodora was not publicly strangled, but died in 548 AD from what may have been cancer. He defended his tampering with history by stating that in the theater, it would obviously be absurd to make Mary Stuart die of consumption, Marie Antoinette of poison, or Jeanne d'Arc in her bed, but an end so obscure as that of Theodora authorizes me, I suppose, and in imagining her a death more Byzantine than the real one. Sardou's enthusiasm for historical authenticity was shared by his star. Sardou's enthusiasm for historical authenticity was shared by his star. Weeks before ordering her costumes, she journeyed to Ravenna and stood long hours in the church of San Vital, studying the magnificent mosaics with their startling portraits of Theodora and Justinian staring menacingly forth from barbaric gold. She made sketches of every robe, every fold, every detail of ornamentation. When she returned to Paris, she had completed in detail a dressmaker's design for each outfit, as well as those for her stage jeweler, even to that death-dealing hairpin. Her wardrobe alone cost more than the average production. Her costumer figured out that toiling in her workrooms, she and her assistants had sewn on by hand more than 4,500 gems. How the actress could move, and move with such grace, under the weight of these encrusted garments was one of the miracles of her magic. Theodora, which opened the day after Christmas, 1884, was the greatest triumph for the two S's, partnership with the future exception of Tosca. Oh, I read that with the wrong influence, sorry. Theodora, which opened the day after Christmas, 1884, was the greatest triumph for the two S's partnership, with the future exception of Tosca. As one biographer put it, and when it comes to accounts of triumphal events, the French can't resist Neapolitanic analogy. Theodora was Sarah Bernhardt's Austerlitz. She played the exotic empress with tigerish abandon. Among the other cheering critics, wrote of the aura about her that made one think of Salome, of Salammbô, of the fantastic queens of Gustave Moreau. A distant and chimerical creature, both hieratic and serpentine, with a lure both majestic and sensual. Theodora was a smash hit of 1884 to 1885. It ran for 300 performances in Paris and over 100 in London. It could have gone on well into the following year if Sarah hadn't listened to some stupid advice from her leading man, Philippe Garnier, who was giving a magnificent performance as Justinian, and should have been content to keep on collecting his salary and the public acclaim he was receiving in the role. It had taken some strong persuasion to get Garnier to sign up. He still resented Damala's ousting him 2 years previously in Russia, but after a certain amount of stalling, he was back again as Bernhardt's leading man. He was also back as her lover. Garnier was an attractive person and a good actor, though not by any measure a great one. He had much self-assurance and, in his own opinion, was quite an expert on theatrical matters. Whether or not Sarah's emotional involvement with him was at all profound, she let herself for a time be swayed by Garnier's judgment, which was anything but sound. His first project was for her to put on a production of Victor Hugo's Marion Delorme.